He said it at the dinner table on a Sunday afternoon in October, in front of my son, my daughter-in-law, and both of my grandchildren. I am 78 years old. I had spent over 2 decades keeping books for a living. I understood numbers, projections, risk, in a way that most people in that room never had and never would. None of that mattered, because when I finished speaking, my son sighed, not the tired kind, but the irritated kind, the kind that says you have already been too much for too long, and he said, "Mum, your opinion doesn't matter anymore." The room went still. My daughter-in-law Diane studied the tablecloth. My grandson Tyler kept his eyes on his plate. My granddaughter Gracie looked at her glass. No one offered a word in my defense. No one said, "That wasn't fair." No one looked at me with anything other than a careful, practiced vacancy. I sat at a table I had helped furnish, in a house I had helped support for years, and I smiled, because I had learned a long time ago that smiling was the thing you did when you had no other safe option. And I finished my meal in silence. My name is Evelyn Parker. I grew up in a small town in eastern Ohio, the youngest of 4, in a house where care was something you gave without waiting to be asked. My mother was that kind of woman, and her mother before her. You took care of your family, you kept the peace. You swallowed the complaints before they reached your mouth. I married Harold at 24, and we built our life slowly and carefully, the way people did in those years. Savings accounts and second-hand furniture, and patience that always stretched further than money did. Harold worked at the plant. I went back to work when our son Marcus was 8, as a bookkeeper for a local hardware company, and I was good at it in the particular way that suited me. Quietly, without needing praise, without drawing attention to the fact that the books were right because I had checked them twice. Numbers made sense to me in a way that little else did. They didn't shift depending on who was in the room. They told the truth, and I appreciated that more than most people understood. If you have ever felt invisible inside your own family, not ignored in the obvious way, but slowly moved to the edges of rooms where the real conversations happen, then I believe you will understand everything I'm about to share with you. Subscribe if you would like to stay, and tell me in the comments where you are watching from today, because sometimes knowing that someone out there is listening makes all the difference. We made sure Marcus had more than we'd had. College, which neither Harold nor I had attended. A used car when he turned 21 that we spent 4 months saving to buy properly. A wedding that I set aside money for quietly, 1 paycheck at a time, over nearly 3 years, and never mentioned how long it had taken, because that wasn't the point. When he married Diane, I welcomed her the way you welcome someone who has now become part of something you spent your life building, with open hands and genuine warmth. Tyler came first, and then Gracie 4 years later, and those 2 children became the centre of my world in a way that nothing had been since Harold was alive. I babysat on weekdays and weekends without needing to be asked twice. I drove them to appointments when Diane's car was in the shop. I cooked Sunday dinners that everyone came to, year after year, without much discussion about whether they would. And there was an account, a savings account I had managed carefully through decades of discipline, that I used quietly to help Marcus and his family when things got tight. A bill at the wrong moment. The car repair that couldn't wait. Once, a full month's rent when Diane had lost her job and Marcus was too proud to bring himself to ask directly. I never spoke about those moments after they passed. I simply helped. That was what I had always done, and I had never thought to question it. For the first several years, that arrangement was warm and genuine on both sides. Diane called on Saturday mornings, and we would talk for an hour, about the children, about what she was reading, about small domestic things that carried an easy intimacy. Marcus stopped by on Sunday mornings before picking up the children, and we would sit at my kitchen table with coffee and talk in the unhurried way that I had come to love. There were thank you notes on my refrigerator, flowers on my birthday, chosen carefully, a card from Gracie one Mother's Day that I kept in my nightstand drawer for years. I believed those things were the real shape of our relationship. I think they were at the time. I don't think anyone was performing gratitude they didn't feel. I think it was genuine, and I think it simply, gradually, without anyone deciding it should, stopped being something anyone thought about. These things don't arrive with a date and a signature. They arrive the way fog does, slowly, silently, thickening through weeks and months until you look up one morning and realise you can no longer see the road you thought you knew. Marcus's Sunday visits became shorter. A quick stop, a few words exchanged standing in the doorway, and then he was already glancing at his phone before he had finished his coffee. Diane's calls stretched to every other week, then once a month, then not at all. I told myself they were busy. I told myself I understood the particular pressure of raising children and managing a household and doing all of it while the world moved faster every year than it had the year before. I told myself these things with great consistency, because the alternative, that something had genuinely shifted in how they saw me, was a thought I was not ready to face. At family dinners, I began to feel like someone watching a film through a window. Marcus and Diane talked to each other and talked over each other and laughed about things the children had done and debated where to go for the holidays and what appliance needed replacing. The conversation moved fast and easy between them. When I said something, offered a thought about one of the grandchildren, mentioned something I had read, gently raised a concern, there was a brief pause, a small, polite breath of acknowledgement, and then the conversation moved forward as though my words had dissolved the moment they left my mouth. It wasn't cruel. That was what made it so difficult to confront. Cruelty has edges you can point to. This was something softer and more complete, the quiet, accumulated experience of becoming irrelevant while still sitting at the table. Tyler barely looked up from his phone when I visited. Gracie would give me a hug and then be somewhere else entirely in her attention within 30 seconds. I understood that teenagers inhabit a world of their own. I did not expect to be at its centre. But there is a specific difference between a teenager's natural distraction and the feeling of being tolerated by people who once ran to meet you at the door. I had started to know that difference, even if I was not yet ready to say so out loud. I began keeping a small notebook, an old habit from my bookkeeping years, the need to set things down on paper rather than let them blur and soften in memory. I started noting the dates of Marcus's phone calls, what was discussed, whether a financial need had come up in the same conversation or in the days immediately surrounding it. I did this almost unconsciously, without thinking too deliberately about what I was looking for. It was simply what I did when I needed to understand something. I wrote it down and looked at it plainly. After 3 months, I looked at what I had written. In 90 days, Marcus had called me 11 times. 8 of those calls had arrived within 48 hours of a bill, a repair, or some other financial pressure coming due. The remaining 3 were my birthday, Christmas Day, and the day after I had called him first to ask whether everything was all right. I sat with that notebook for a long time. I didn't write anything else in it. I simply looked at what the numbers said, the way I had always looked at numbers, directly, without trying to rearrange what I saw into a shape that was easier to carry. Then came the October Sunday. Diane had made a roast. Someone had put a scented candle on the kitchen counter that smelled like cinnamon, and the leaves outside the window were red and gold, and from the outside it looked like a warm, ordinary family dinner. Marcus was talking about a business investment, a friend's venture he was considering joining as a financial partner. The amounts he mentioned were significant. I listened carefully to everything he said, and when he finished, I offered something carefully, that the arrangement he was describing reminded me of a structure I had seen go wrong in the early 1980 seconds. I said it once, without alarm, without making it larger than it needed to be. I was not lecturing, I was sharing something from 40 years of working with numbers, offered the way you offer something you genuinely believe might help. He let me finish. Then he sighed. Not from weariness, but from a particular kind of irritation, the kind that carries a long history behind it. And he said, "Mom, your opinion doesn't matter anymore." The table went quiet. Diane looked down at the cloth in front of her plate. Tyler focused on his food with sudden concentration. Gracie looked at her glass. The silence lasted perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, and then someone said something unremarkable, and the conversation moved on as naturally as water finding a new channel. I smiled, the small, careful smile I had been practicing my whole life. I said nothing. I ate the rest of my meal, helped clear the table, said my good nights with warmth I manufactured carefully, and drove home on roads I had known for 40 years. I sat in my kitchen with the lights off. I stayed there for a very long time. Tell me honestly, have you ever sat at a table that should have been yours and felt completely invisible? The nights that followed were not restful. I kept turning those words over in the dark, not because they were entirely surprising. Something in me had been bracing for the shape of them for longer than I wanted to admit, but because they had finally been spoken aloud. Something that had been building quietly for years had been given a voice, and the voice had said, "You are not seen here." Not as a person with knowledge and experience and something worth hearing. You are accommodated. You are maintained. You are useful in the specific ways you are useful, and invisible in everything else. That was the truth I had been refusing to look at directly. Now it had said its own name. A few weeks after that Sunday, I went by Marcus's house to retrieve a scarf I had left the previous weekend. The front door was unlocked, as it often was, and I stepped inside and heard Diane in the next room on the phone. She was speaking easily, in the comfortable, unguarded tone of someone deep in a conversation with a close friend. I wasn't trying to listen. I was simply standing in the hallway, holding my coat, when I heard her say, lightly, almost as an aside, "As long as she keeps helping out financially, it'll all be fine. She's not going to stop." A small laugh, a pause, then the conversation moved on to something else. I stood there for a moment. Then I turned and walked back out to my car and sat in the driveway with my hands in my lap until I could trust myself to drive. I thought about Harold that afternoon, sitting in my garden with a cup of tea I had long since stopped tasting. He used to say that the hardest thing in the world was knowing when to stop giving something to people who had forgotten how to receive it. I had thought, when he said it, 20 years ago in this same garden, in this same fading afternoon light, that I understood what he meant. I hadn't. Not really. Not the way you understand something when it is no longer abstract and has arrived, finally, at your own front door. I called my bank the following Thursday and asked them to close the account. The woman at the counter was professionally kind and asked me once whether I was certain. I told her I was. The process took less than an hour. I drove home, made tea, and went out to sit in the garden, and stayed there until the evening turned cold around me. I did not tell anyone. I wrote no letters and left no messages and made no calls to prepare anyone for what was coming. I had spent a great many years explaining myself to people who had already decided not to listen, and I found I had no interest in doing it anymore. I simply let the account disappear the way I had been disappearing, quietly, without ceremony, without asking anyone's permission. The consequences came within 2 weeks. A payment failed. A financial arrangement that had depended, invisibly and without acknowledgement, on a deposit that never arrived, began to fall apart. Marcus called 3 times in a single day. I let the first 2 calls go to voicemail. When I answered the third, his voice had moved through careful and tight and arrived at something openly upset. He wanted to know what had happened to the account. I told him calmly that I had closed it. He asked why. I told him the truth, that I was no longer willing to support, financially or otherwise, a relationship in which I was valued for what I provided and invisible as a person. That I had spent years pretending not to notice what I had noticed very clearly. That when he told me my opinion didn't matter, I believed him, and I had decided to act accordingly. He said I was being selfish. I said I understood why it felt that way from where he was standing. He said harder things after that, and I listened to all of them without interrupting. When he was finished, I told him I hoped things settled soon. Then I ended the call. Diane called the following morning. Her voice carried an edge I hadn't heard from her before. Not anger precisely, but the sound of someone whose assumptions had been suddenly exposed. She said I was punishing the grandchildren for something that wasn't their fault. She said she had always done her best to make me feel part of the family. She said that what I had done was cruel to people who depended on me. I listened to everything she said. I didn't argue any of it. I told her I hoped the situation stabilized quickly for all of them, and I ended the call. What I had expected to feel was guilt. I had organized most of my adult life around managing that feeling, the deep, reflexive pull toward keeping everyone comfortable at whatever cost to my own clarity. But sitting in my kitchen after that call, with the morning light coming through the window, what I felt was something very different. A stillness. Not coldness, not emptiness. Something closer to the quiet that settles in a room after a sound you had stopped noticing has finally, after a very long time, stopped. In the months that followed, I built something different. I joined a garden club that met on Tuesday afternoons. A group of women, mostly around my age, who laughed easily and argued pleasantly about soil composition and which varieties did best in the local climate. I started attending concerts at the community centre on Friday evenings, the kind I had always meant to go to and never quite had. I called my friend Dorothy in Cleveland, whom I hadn't spoken to properly in nearly 3 years. We talked for 2 hours that first call, and made plans to drive up to Niagara Falls in the spring, something we had loosely discussed since 1987 and had simply never managed to actually do. I cooked real meals for myself, not something quick pulled together because eating alone felt like a reason not to bother, but proper food, the kind I used to make on Sundays when the house was full. I bought good olive oil and fresh herbs, and I ate slowly at my own table in the evenings, and looked out at the garden, and found to my own mild surprise that I did not feel as lonely as I had anticipated. Something that had been contracted in me for a long time, tightened against something I could not quite name, began very slowly to open. Marcus appeared at my door on a Saturday morning in February, 4 months after I had closed the account. He hadn't called ahead. He knocked, and I let him in, and he stood in my kitchen looking older and slightly diminished in a way I had not seen before. We sat at the table, the same table where I had sat in the dark the night I drove home from his house in October, and he talked for a long time. He said that my support had become so constant, so quietly reliable, that he had stopped thinking of it as something I gave. It had become like running water or electricity, something that simply existed, whose source he had stopped considering. He said he was ashamed of that. He said the words from the dinner table had come back to him many times in the months since he had spoken them, and that he had not liked what he heard when they returned. He said he was sorry, not in the light, managed way of someone trying to resolve a situation, but in the harder way, the kind that costs something to say because it requires admitting that you were wrong, in a manner that cannot be dressed up as a misunderstanding. I did not forgive him in that single conversation. Real forgiveness doesn't happen in a moment. It is built slowly from ordinary accumulated time, from small, consistent acts that eventually become the new ground you are both standing on. What I did that morning was listen. I let him finish. I did not offer reassurance before he had earned it. When he left, something between us had changed. Not restored to what it had been, but altered, shifted towards something more honest. The ground between us was still uneven, but at least we were both standing on it now. Over the months that followed, things changed in ways that were small and real. Marcus called sometimes without a reason attached, a Tuesday evening just to say he had been thinking about me. Diane asked my opinion once about a situation she was navigating at work, and actually listened to the answer, following the thread of it rather than simply waiting for me to finish. Tyler, who was not naturally sentimental at 17, asked me one afternoon if I would show him how I had done bookkeeping. He was taking a finance class and something hadn't made sense to him. We sat at my kitchen table for nearly 2 hours. I showed him how I had organised accounts, traced discrepancies, reconciled figures that had looked at first like they would never balance. He followed every step. He asked real questions. He was genuinely interested in a way that surprised me more than almost anything else that happened that year. Not because it was large, but because it was entirely unasked for. Gracie started calling on Sunday mornings. Not every Sunday, but enough that I came to look forward to it and to notice warmly when she did. None of this resolved into something clean. Families are not stories with tidy endings. They are ongoing and uneven and sometimes disappointing and occasionally, without warning, full of something that looks like grace. What changed was not that my family had been transformed into different people. What changed was that I had stopped organising my sense of self around the question of whether they approved of me. I was 78 years old, and I had spent most of those years making myself available, making myself useful, making myself smaller when smallness seemed to be what the room required. I had given from love, genuinely, but I had also given from fear. The fear that if I stopped, I would become truly and finally invisible to the people I loved most. That the place I held in their lives was conditional, and the condition was my usefulness. What I discovered when I finally stopped was that my worth had never required their recognition to exist. It had been there the entire time, unchanged and entire, the way a garden is still present in winter, even when nothing visible remains above the frozen ground. I spend my evenings differently now. Some nights I sit in the garden until the air turns cold. Other nights I read, or I call Dorothy, or I simply sit with the quiet of the house and find, to my own quiet surprise, that it no longer unsettles me the way it once did. I am not waiting for anyone to tell me what I am worth. I already know I am here. Tell me, when people stop seeing your worth, how do you remember who you are?